But for the families of the 9 people who were killed, the ordeal was only beginning. Kevin and Susan Campbell's son Lee had been flying home.
About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I think they said that there was no New Zealanders involved, but we just knew that it was Lee. And then about, I suppose, a quarter of an hour later, we got a phone call from Chicago, and they just said that they regret to inform us that our son was missing, presumed dead. And I guess about another hour after that, a policeman arrived at the door, and he took one look at us and he says, "I can see that you've had the news." So it was just an awful day. And it certainly didn't get much better for a long time.
Although Lee's body had not been recovered, the Campbells flew straight to the wrecked aircraft in Honolulu.
Your initial feeling is that you want to be as close to the spot where your relative died, and that was the aircraft. So we had to immediately go in and see the aircraft.
The damage inside was horrific, just a total mess. And the hole in the side of the aircraft was much bigger than I had thought it would be, even though we had seen television newsreel reports. And it was so sad to get in and actually see where Lee's seat had been. The legs of the seat were still there. There was a good bit of fuselage beside him, and still a window.
But the Campbells' desire to find the cause of Lee's death inevitably brought them face to face with dreadful details.
They took us to the medical examiner's office as well, because they had found body parts and that sort of thing. So they didn't actually show us the body parts, but they showed us bits and pieces that they had recovered from the engines, and we got the medical examiner's report on what they had recovered. So, we really would have preferred that it was Lee that went through the engine, because it would have been an immediate death, whereas it was a 4-minute fall down to the ocean, and we know that the people could have been alive as they were falling. And when you think about that, that's just horrific.
As it became clear that their son's body would never be found, the Campbells' need to find the cause of the accident that killed him grew stronger.
Lee can't have died for nothing. You've got to find out why he died, and you've just got to make sure that it never happens again.
The Campbells embarked on a relentless personal investigation that would last nearly 2 years. The loss of their son meant they would stop at nothing to uncover the truth.
The engines number 3 and 4.
2 months after the accident on Flight 811, when the National Transportation Safety Board held preliminary hearings, the Campbells made sure they were there. But they soon grew frustrated. The NTSB would not complete its report for months, so the Campbells took matters into their own hands.
We certainly weren't going to leave it to the NTSB to come up with the findings. We were going to follow through. And when the hearings ended, they had said that we could take whatever we wanted off the press table. And Susan walked up to the top table and yelled out, "There's a really good setup here." So grabbed a box and loaded in all of the documents that we could find up there.
Kevin's the most honest of people I know, but here he was taking something that we hadn't specifically been told we could take.
And we're heading out the door just as the NTSB were arriving back in with the trolley to pick up all their documents. So we were out the door and into a taxi and gone.
So we quickly realised we'd got a really good set of papers with a lot of things that hadn't been released to the public. We were able to really start our investigation in earnest at that stage.
The unpublished documents revealed a disturbing catalogue of problems with the forward cargo door, going right back to its original design. Instead of a plug door that gets jammed into its frame as the aircraft pressurizes, Boeing opted for an outward opening door. This allowed for more cargo space, but was not fail-safe like the plug design. So Boeing built what they believed was a foolproof locking mechanism.
What they do is they build in multiple redundancies to make sure the door is properly latched and does not open. And you build it in to a point of that it's extremely improbable that the door would ever open.
So what went wrong on Flight 811? The Campbells soon discovered that the problem lay in the design of the locking mechanism. To lock the cargo door on the 747, electric motors rotate C-shaped latches around pins in the door frame. A handle then moves arms, known as locking sectors, over the top of the C latches to prevent them from reopening. But as early as 1975, problems were found with the locking sectors. Kevin Campbell, an engineer by training, built a model to show the weakness in the Boeing design.
Initially, the locking sectors were made in aluminium, and in 1975, Boeing realised that they weren't strong enough, and they actually doubled up the aluminium to make it double thickness. But it still wasn't strong enough, and a lot of the airlines didn't even put the doublers on anyway.
The weakness of the aluminium drastically increased the risk of the door accidentally opening.
With the aluminium locking sectors, if the C-locks tried to backwind, open electrically, it would just push the locking sector out of the way. It just simply wasn't up to the job that it was designed for.
For 20 years, 747s have been flying with this crucial weakness. The Campbells wondered what else remained to be revealed. They redoubled their efforts to uncover the full truth behind the accident that had killed their son.
We bought a car and set off in the United States to see as many people who were involved with the accident as possible. We started at Seattle, down to Denver, across to Chicago, through to Washington, D.C., down to Kentucky, on to Miami, and back across to San Diego, back up through San Francisco, back to Seattle. And that was just one trip.
The Campbells soon found that a shockingly similar incident to Flight 811 had given clear warnings of the dangers in the cargo door. In 1987, 2 years before Flight 811, a Pan Am 747 had been climbing out of Heathrow when it failed to pressurize at 20,000 feet. The pilots had to turn back.
When they got back to Heathrow, they found that the door was hanging open 1.5 inches at the bottom, and all of the locks were open. When it got to the maintenance base, they found that all of the locking sectors were either bent or broken.
Why had the C latches turned and bent back the locking sectors? Boeing claimed that the ground crew must have mishandled the mechanism.
The door had been closed manually, and what they said happened was that the guy wound the C-locks closed, 98 turns of a speed wrench. He closed the outer handle and then wound it open again. And if to be in the position that they were found in when the aircraft got back, he would have had to wind them open 98 turns. And this is just absolutely ridiculous.
But the Campbells' investigation uncovered another vital clue to why the C latches had turned. A report by Pan Am engineers highlighted problems with the door's electrical system.
It had a fault in the S2 master latch lock switch that should have turned off the power to the door when the outer handle was closed.
This was an alarming finding. When the outer handle was closed, the S2 master lock switch was meant to disconnect the power supply and stop the C-latch motors from turning. So could this have failed, allowing the motors to open the door? To find out, Boeing asked the airlines to do a simple test. Close the outer handle, then press the switch to open the door, and see what happens.
When they hit the switch, it actually worked. The Boeing thought, this is not going to work, but it actually worked. There was power to the door locks with the outer handle closed, and the lock started to move, and it started to force the locking sectors out of the way. And a few days later, the airline started ringing in and saying it was damaging their planes. So Boeing stopped the test. But it meant that on those aircraft, the S2 switch had failed, which is a silent failure. And all of those aircraft were likely to have the same problem as 811. They were just waiting for a short circuit to open the doors.
The Campbells now became convinced that the accident on Flight 811 began with a failure of the S2 switch. Power remained on to the C-latch motors. All it took was a short circuit in the 20-year-old wiring, which had been found to be frayed on other aircraft, to start the motors up. The aluminium locking sectors were too weak to stop the latches turning, and the cargo door burst open.
The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this accident was the sudden
After waiting a year for the NTSB report, Kevin and Susan Campbell expected it to match their theory of what had led to the accident on Flight 811.
I assumed that we would have a report come out that this was an electrical malfunction, and was staggered when they came out and said that the door had been mishandled.
The report focused entirely on the fact that the door lock must have been mishandled by the ramp attendant. That was disappointing, and we felt that they must have been at a different hearing from the one we were at.
So how had the NTSB come to their conclusion?
There was other evidence that we had found during our investigation of improper procedures by the United Mechanics and ramp people. So we were convinced that there was, we could use the word abuse being done on the doors. The doors were sort of abused and weren't maintained very well. We concluded that the probable cause was mechanical.
For the Campbells, the NTSB's failure to mention the electrical problems just wasn't good enough.
What they said happened was the door was closed, the locks didn't fully close, they just partially closed, just hanging on the pins, and then they closed the outer handle. But it just simply can't happen because that part of the locking sector is still intact. Just simply can't happen. You can't close the outer handle unless these are in the fully locked position. It's the only way that the outer handle will close. And just closing this manually, you can't exert enough force to actually damage this part of the locking sector. All it does is just butts up against there. If the locks aren't fully closed, it just simply butts up against them and goes no further.
They went back to investigating the accident on Flight 811 and soon found disturbing evidence of how it could and should have been prevented. After the Pan Am incident in 1987, it turned out that Boeing had issued a directive to the airlines on how to correct the weak aluminium locking sectors.
The airworthiness directive that came out was to replace the aluminum sectors with steel sectors that could not be bent. And there were some some interim requirements for inspections to be performed until what they call terminating action, the steel sectors were installed.
The fix was cheap and simple, but getting it done was not.
The actual cost of the modification, changing these locking sectors to steel, was $2,000 per aircraft. But it took 10 hours to do it, and that's where the money was. Taking the aircraft out of service for 10 hours, that's millions of dollars.
The Campbells found that back in 1987, the Federal Aviation Administration, who were meant to enforce improvements, had given the airlines 18 months to comply with the modification. Within a year, Lee Campbell and 8 others would die in an avoidable accident. So why weren't the airlines forced to fix the problem sooner?
If these airplanes these large commercial airplanes are grounded. It's an economic disaster. So what they do is they lobby in the regulatory agency in the United States, it's the FAA, to allow them to do the fixes over time when the airplanes are in for normal maintenance. And that way, they're not taken out of service. But when they do that, when they allow the airlines, the air carriers, and the manufacturers to fix these over time, in essence what the FAA is doing is they're gambling with the lives of the passengers and the crew that are flying the airplanes during the time they're not fixed.
After the deaths on Flight 811, the FAA instantly shortened the deadline for fixing the cargo door from 18 months to just 30 days.
It was only when United had gone from one of the airlines of first resort to one of the airlines of last resort in New Zealand that they, just totally out of the blue, we got a letter inviting us over to see them. And when we got there, they were just going to do a PR exercise on us. But we just laid into them, pointed out where they'd all got it wrong.
And you could see them changing during it to realising that we did know what we were talking about and that we'd put a lot of serious effort into it.
One of them actually broke down because they'd never had to meet next of kin before. And it ended up with the Vice President of United taking us round the maintenance facility, and he had people running off in all directions just to get the information that we wanted, questions answered. We could go anywhere that we wanted, and everything was laid on for us because at that stage they realised that we really did know what we were talking about.
The pressure of the Campbell's campaign eventually began to pay off. The vital piece of evidence that could prove them right, the cargo door, still lay 2 miles down in the Pacific Ocean. But as articles appeared in the American press, the NTSB commissioned the US Navy to search for it. 100 miles south of Honolulu, a deep submersible began to trawl the seabed.
We went to Honolulu and waited there while they had their attempts, and they finally recovered the door from 14,000 feet of water, which was the deepest recovery ever at that time. And we were phoned within an hour of it coming out of the water.
But before the Campbells could see it, the door was swiftly removed to Boeing's plant in Seattle. The Campbells went in hot pursuit.
We went over to Boeing and they wouldn't show it to us. So they reckoned that the crucial pieces had gone to the NTSB. So again, we got in the car and drove across to Washington, D.C. We arrived at Ron Schleid's office, and Ron looks at his watch and he says, "I can give you 5 minutes." So about 3 hours later, we had the pieces that they recovered in our hand, and they acknowledged that we were definitely correct. It was an electrical malfunction, and that they said they would fix the planes, they would make sure it never happens again, but just don't hold your breath that the report will ever be changed.
Even with the evidence of an electrical malfunction in their hands, the NTSB refused to change their report. Then, in June 1991, fate intervened. A 4-year-old United 747 was sitting on the apron in New York when the C-latch motors started up and the door opened itself.
There was no way that they could hide it any longer. They simply couldn't deny that it was an electrical malfunction that was covering it.
After recovery of the door was that in fact the actual pieces
Finally, the NTSB publicly issued a revised report that concurred with the Campbell's version.
there was an inadvertent failure of either the switch or the wiring that caused an uncommanded opening of the door.
It's nice that other people know that you're right and had been all along, and that the support that they had given you was vindicated.
The Campbells spent thousands of dollars of their own money on their campaign. They were never interested in a financial settlement for Lee's death, but they did persuade United and Boeing to set up a university scholarship in his name.
I couldn't have lived with myself if we had done no investigating ourselves. It was just something we both felt we needed to do. We didn't even discuss it. We just knew that's what we would do.
Yeah.
But despite long and public campaigns like that of the Campbells, critics fear that the airline industry has not learnt the lessons from Flight 811.
The regulatory agencies, they have a dual charge. One is to encourage aviation, and another is aviation safety. And when they get in a position where you have economics up against air safety, they tend to err on the side of economics rather than safety.
Serious accidents caused by known defects have continued to occur. In the 1990s, known problems with icing on aircraft wings caused a series of crashes. At least 3 planes have had fatal fires due to known dangers from flammable insulation material. And in 1996, a fully laden 747 blew itself up when known faults in the wiring are thought to have ignited flammable vapors in the fuel tanks. Inevitably, experts are skeptical about the aviation industry's record of balancing profit against prevention.
We've seen the wiring problem both in United 811, which was eventually turned out to be the cause of that accident, and also in TWA 800, where we had an explosion in the centerline fuel tank. The industry answer to 20 and 30-year-old wiring, and when the wiring can fray, break, crack, cause a short, which can either ignite fuel, like in TW 800, or open a cargo door, like in United 11. And what the industry says, don't touch it. Don't go in there. Don't inspect it. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to remove it, because it's so brittle that if you go in there to try to fix it, you're going to do more damage than you're going to do good. And that's what I call the ostrich approach to maintenance and safety. You know, we've decided that you can have a spark of ignition in the centerline fuel tank of a large air carrier. But so far we've been lucky. We've only had one every 10 years. We've only blown up 3 or 4 airplanes. You know, to go in and replace this wiring would ground all these airplanes, would be astronomically expensive. You know, 1 airplane every 10 years, 1 airplane every 5 years, 200-300 people, cost of doing business. Cost of doing business. And that's a great economic analysis, and unless your mother or your child is on board one of these airplanes that happens to pay the price for their economic satisfaction.
For some of the survivors of Flight 811, the cost has been heavy.
Each crew member handled it differently. I know there are still 2 crew members that have never set foot on an aircraft again. It was very difficult for me. I was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. You can't reason, you can't think. Making the slightest decision is very difficult. You're just at a total loss. So it was very difficult to cope with.